and broadcast. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Daphne Lazar-Price, and I'm the Executive Director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. It's my privilege to welcome our guest, Keshet Starr, the Executive Director of ORA, the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot. ORA is the only nonprofit organization addressing the agunah, Jewish divorce refusal crisis, on a case-by-case basis worldwide. At ORA, Keshet oversees advocacy and early intervention initiatives designed to assist individuals seeking a Jewish divorce, along with prevention initiatives to eliminate abuse from the Jewish divorce process. Keshet has written for outlets such as the Times of Israel, the Forward and Haaretz, and I hope one day for the JOFA blog, and frequently presents on issues related to Jewish divorce, domestic abuse, and the intersection between civil and religious divorce processes. Keshet has also authored academic work focused on get refusal and domestic abuse and is a Wexner Field Fellow. A graduate of the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Keshet lives in central New Jersey with her husband and 3 young children. Welcome, Keshet. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So tell us more about your work, about ORA. Give us some history and background.
Absolutely. So ORA was founded actually in 2002 as a student group at Yeshiva University. So it started in a dorm room, and thankfully we're not in a dorm room anymore. We've grown over the years, but we really have our background in grassroots activism. And essentially our mission in a nutshell is that we want to take abuse out of the Jewish divorce process. I think our hope is that when people go through the Jewish divorce system, that it's going to be ideally a moment of healing and closure, sort of a punctuation mark at the end of this chapter in their lives with this marriage, and that the divorce should never involve extortion, abuse, or anything of that nature. So that's sort of the change we want to see in the world. In terms of how we get there, we have 3 main program areas, and the way we sort of think about our work is that we want to intervene and make a difference in agunah cases at different points along the process. And of course, the earlier we can intervene in a situation and prevent it from devolving, we're so happy to do that. And so our biggest program is really our active agunah cases. We work on about 75 active cases at a time. We have a team of amazing case advocates who are really the heroes at ORA, who work one-on-one with agunot, with actually a few agunim as well. And they create individualized strategic plans for each case and make those plans happen. And so people always ask, well, what do we actually do? And the truth is it really varies. We work to make sure that anything we're doing is something the agunah is comfortable with. The 2 boundaries that we work within is that on one hand, we won't do anything that's illegal. So no baseball bats or brass knuckled gloves or anything along those lines. And the other boundary is that we don't do anything that would make the get invalid under Jewish law. Between those 2 boundaries, we do whatever we think is going to work. Sometimes it's having a demonstration outside their home or their place of business. Sometimes it's getting an article about them in the newspaper. Sometimes it's actually, in a surprising way, helping the get refuser get support and therapy and maybe some resources that they need in order to be able to move on in a healthy way. So again, it varies, but we really want to make sure that the fact that this person is withholding a get, that impacts them. They can't just go about their day as if nothing's happening and nothing's wrong, but there's a counter pressure. Very often if someone doesn't want to give a get, if there's a little bit of pressure in another direction, that might make them go ahead and do it. So we try to create that counter pressure. And then in addition to the advocacy piece, we also have a program, sort of like an early intervention type program. It's a Jewish divorce helpline. It's called One Step Forward. It's staffed by an amazing social worker. And the goal for that program is for people to reach out to us when they're thinking about divorce or in the very early stages, so we can help them really set themselves up for success in the divorce process. Sometimes I compare it to trying to win a baseball game. If you have no idea like which direction you're supposed to run in or what the bases are supposed to do, like you're not going to win probably. And most people, and I think women in particular, they don't know the first thing about baked in and Jewish divorce, even if they know all the ins and outs about how to keep a kosher kitchen or certain other aspects of halakha. They generally don't know this at all. And when you're trying to navigate a system that you really don't understand the first thing about, you're probably not going to do it successfully. And of course, when we're dealing with a context of domestic abuse where there's a real risk of that system being manipulated, then we worry even more about people not understanding what they're supposed to be doing. So the helpline really works with people to structure the process. If you need a get and you also need a divorce and you're also living together and this is happening and that's happening, what do you do first, second, and third? How do you figure out a strategy that's going to put you in a strong position at the end? So that's another piece. And then the final piece, although last but not least, is trying to intervene even earlier in the divorce process. And that's really before the couple even gets married. And so that is really about encouraging the community to sign the Halachic Prenup in sort of a global way. And so a little bit about the prenup, I always like to give just a general introduction to how the prenup works, and then talk specifically about why the prenup is actually a really effective tool to address some of the biggest issues that we see in our cases at ORA. One of the neat things in a way about ORA is that because we have this range of programs, we also really combine theory and practice. We're thinking about this issue, but we're also seeing this issue play out and how those cases evolve over time as well. So the prenup has two main components to it. The first piece is that it's an arbitration agreement. So the couple essentially is signing a commitment that in the event that something goes wrong in that relationship, that they are going to submit the issue of the get to the Beth Din of America, or theoretically to another Beth Din. And we'll talk more about why that matters. And then the second piece is that it basically, the prenup enforces a halachic support obligation. That the idea is that in Jewish law, husbands and wives have responsibilities to one another. So the setup is that if you want to stay halachically married to your spouse, but not give them a get, that you can't sort of have your halachic cake and eat it too. If you want to stay halachically married, awesome, but you need to then fulfill the responsibilities that come with halachic marriage. So the prenup basically creates this system where for every day a husband refuses to give a get after the Beth Din has told him he has to, then he has to pay his wife $150 a day in support of his halachic obligations to her. And many couples who come to the ORA office prefer to sign a reciprocal version that basically goes both ways. Just like the husband has to give the wife $150 a day, she has to give him $150 a day in lieu of her own halachic obligations. So essentially, those are the two main pieces. So the reason why it matters, first of all, the arbitration agreement piece. Generally, that doesn't seem very exciting to people. Who cares that we signed an arbitration agreement? Like, why is that a big deal? The truth is, though, that in the United States, there are a million different Bati Din. They all have very different standards and procedures. And just figuring out where you're going to go to litigate something is actually very difficult and often takes a really long time. So we work on many cases in our advocacy department where we spend years, like literally years, trying to get the couple to agree on which forum they're going to. So the fact that the prenup means you've already selected your forum, it's like you're starting a race 15 steps ahead. Like it is a real advantage in the event that you do have to go through the divorce process. And not only that, but the beauty of a prenup is that you're getting people at their moment of greatest flexibility. They're in love, they're planning the wedding, everything's great. There's actually a great moment to try and get them to agree on things. We're trying to get the same two people to agree on the same terms in the event of a divorce with all of the conflict involved is going to be much, much harder. And the second piece is this support obligation, which might sound complicated or unhelpful, but I think the creative genius behind this idea is that it allows us to have the best of both worlds. That one of the central challenges of dealing with get refusal in the United States in 2019 is that on one hand, the Beth Din really doesn't have legal powers. A Beth Din can't freeze your driver's license or garnish child support from your bank account. They don't have that power. But on the other hand, if you go to the civil court for help with those things, then now you have an issue in Jewish law because there's a problem in having sort of a foreign law body, a secular authority, issue certain rulings regarding the get. So the beauty of the prenup is that we get to sort of have it all. We get to take the enforcement powers that the civil court has, but because the prenup establishes that the Beth Din is the body sort of making decisions, we avoid some of the halachic issues that we would have if we didn't have that adjudication system. So it gives us the chance to have the powers that come from the civil system without some of the pitfalls. And the most important reason to sign a prenup, it works. We've seen people get divorced with the prenup. We've seen people with histories of domestic abuse get divorced with the prenup. So we have seen it successful when tested. But I always say the most critical piece about the prenup is that if you live in a community where everyone's signing the prenup, where you're getting that message from your mother-in-law and your rabbi and your bridesmaids, and it's part of the culture, that is a culture that's already a signal to everyone that this is not going to be a good crowd to be a get refuser in. This is not going to go well. In this community, we're not into that. And that is so powerful. So the most important part of the prenup, it's not just that it'll protect you. It's not just that it'll protect the people around you, which is also important. But most of all, it really sets an intention as to what kind of community you want to live in and what your core values are as a community. And that has a huge impact on people's behavior, even if things don't work out and even if they do end up dealing with a divorce later on. So that's just a little tidbit about ORA, about some of the prevention work that we do, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
Sure. So first of all, just a comment. When I got married in 1999, we signed the prenup. It was actually, I think, in large part, an outcome of having attended the first JOFA conference in 1997, where addressing the agunah issue was really a signature issue for the organization at the outset. And when we got engaged in 1998, we talked about it, and it was a no-brainer for us. Unfortunately, for our rabbi, Rasider Kedushin, who also said that for him it was a no-brainer that he would not, do any marriages for couples without it. Interestingly, for us, the most pushback we got were from friends and family to say, doesn't it feel like you're dooming the relationship from the start if you're bringing it into, if you're having these conversations before you're even married? How much pushback do you still see like that today?
I'd say a fair amount. And I do feel that the number one pushback we get, whether it might be framed as a halachic concern or a legal concern, I think the biggest piece is this like ick factor of, why like it's not good to talk about divorce before you get married and then it's going to undermine sort of the strength of the marriage. So I think it's a huge pushback. And I think part of the challenge is that prenup is a word we associate with like gold diggers or super like Hollywood celebrities trying to make sure that they keep the mansion afterwards. And, it's not sort of a word that we associate with strong marital, relationships and with Jewish values. At the same time, though, the response that we have and sort of the culture change we're trying to do is to sort of address it on a few levels. The first piece is that our messaging is very deliberate, that you shouldn't sign a prenup for yourself, really. You sign it for everyone around you. We always tell people if you're signing the prenup because you think your fiance is that much of a jerk that you're probably going to need it, then you probably need a new fiance and not so much a prenup. Like that's not really what this is for. So we really try and set the messaging that this isn't about you. This isn't personal. Rather, on the contrary, if you're a couple that's healthy and strong in your relationship, so you guys be the nachshon, so to speak, to sort of go out there and start doing it. That it's the healthy couples that will set the trend, and then the other people will do it, and then the people who need it will have it. And the second piece I would add to that as well is that in many ways, I think the prenup is sort of an interesting expression of Jewish values, that we, in some ways, the tradition of how we interact with the ketubah is kind of strange if you think about it. The ketubah talks about, death and divorce. It talks about amounts of money. It's not in any way like a romantic, mushy gushy, I promise to make you your favorite milkshake every morning type of vow, to one another at all. And yet we read it under the chuppah, sitting, in our fancy dress, and we decorate it with like watercolor sunsets and put it on the wall. And I think there's something to that, because what we're ultimately saying when you sign a prenup is that I love you so much that I want you to be protected from anything, even from myself, and that my core value is, really respecting the dignity of every person and respecting your dignity and your personhood. And I'm going to make sure that we start our marriage in a way where that value is really emphasized. So I think in a lot of ways we could shift it. You could think of it as sort of practicing for divorce, or you could think of it as the opposite, as a way of strengthening marriage by emphasizing that really healthy and respectful relationships are what we're looking for.
Nice. So you mentioned, kind of like if he's really pushing back, maybe you need a different fiance. But really, right, sometimes, yes, that is the case. And sometimes it just requires some more intentional counseling and some more thoughtful thinking. And sometimes, if you look at our chinuch system, that boys are not girls too, but, we're not necessarily having these conversations at formative years in our lives. And so some of it is chinuch and some of it is counseling. How much of a role does Ora play in those spaces?
Sure. So a lot of people actually don't realize that we do a lot of that. We obviously have a strong message out there in the community that we think everyone should sign a prenup, and it's very important. But people come to us all the time who are concerned or have pushback, and we really create space for them to have that conversation. We had a couple ones that came in to sign a prenup. It turns out, as we spoke with them, that there were some real concerns on the groom's part with signing it, a lot of anxiety. The couple ended up sitting in our office all day, like they broke for lunch, came back, and talked together and talked with us, did decide in the end to sign it. But there was really a lot of back and forth, and we try very hard to provide some of that counseling. And one thing that I found as well is that in some ways the prenup can actually be an interesting test for the strength of the relationship and the communication. So, for example, I was working recently with a couple that could not agree on signing the prenup, and I was talking to the bride, talking to the groom, talking to them together. And at one point, I was speaking with just the bride, and we were discussing a few aspects of the prenup. And she said, well, can you call my fiance and tell him this, because I can't talk to him. And I said, sort of spoke with her about the fact that, if you're going to be married, I've been married for 10 years, God willing, if you're going to be married, you're going to have a lot of things to talk through. That's a big part of what being married is. There are constantly going to be things that come up that you might not see eye to eye on. You're two people from two families with two different perspectives. And being able to talk about it in a healthy way, in a way that feels safe, is really important. And if you don't feel that sense of, I can call my fiance and ask a question and tell him how I feel, that lack of safety, I think, is actually much more of a concern than necessarily a refusal to sign the prenup itself. If the prenup is a difficult conversation, that's good, because you want to have difficult conversations before you get married. And you want to make sure that you can have them in a respectful and positive way. And if you really, really can't, then that doesn't, again, mean that you need to break up tomorrow. But that could be a good moment to get some counseling, bring in sort of a professional voice to the conversation, and see if you can improve some of those communication pieces.
Walk me through the mechanics of signing the prenup. When do you do it? Who's involved in it? What happens with the actual document after?
Sure. So the best time to sign a prenup is before you get civilly married. A few things that people do that are not ideal. Sometimes people will get civilly married before their halachic marriage and then want to sign a prenup. So the prenup is a civilly binding document. It's really going with your civil marriage, and it is stronger to sign it before you get civilly married. So that's sort of the best moment. We've also seen couples sign the prenup at the wedding. I love the messaging that sends, but weddings are really chaotic. Things sort of get lost. I joke, although it's not a joke, I still don't know what happened to our wedding cake. Like, we saw it at one point. I don't think we ever ate it. You know, there's just a lot of back and forth. And having a legal document that's signed at a wedding, the odds of it just getting spilled wine on it or something like that are high. And in addition to that, from a legal perspective, it's not, the more that someone is signing a legal contract under pressure, the weaker it is. And so signing a document like this at the wedding itself, if it were ever contested in court, like, that's not ideal. So what we suggest is that you sign it before you get married. I think it's very important to understand what you're signing. You never want to sign things if you don't know what they are. And the prenup, there are different variations to the document. There's a standard version that's just about the husband's obligations, and there's a reciprocal one that goes both ways. There are optional sections where you can also ask that the Beit Din adjudicate custody and or finances. There was an older version of the prenup that then allowed you to choose your legal theory of financial distribution. And so there is something to it, to really understanding what you're signing, how it works, and making those decisions. And it's very important to have guidance on how to do that. Some people can't make it to the ORA office in Washington Heights. We have couples come in and we notarize their prenups for them all the time. But even if you can't make it to our office, it's really good to call and just talk through the document with us. Once you have a sense of, you know what you're signing, you know which version and which sections you're going to opt into, then you need a notary and 2 witnesses. The notary can be anyone. And the Beth Din of America also has an online notarization option. So that's something that you can check out, which is convenient. And the witnesses can be anyone. We actually see a lot of people trying to bring in female friends that they want to honor as prenup witnesses, since it's, you know, there's an opportunity that you don't have under the chuppah. And so there are a lot of creative ways that people approach it. Some people just come to the office with the 2 of them and the staff members witness for them, and other people come with like a whole party and snacks and the whole thing. So you can really do it however you want, but it's important to get some information. And then once the prenup's signed, there's another important step. Even if you don't sign the prenup at the ORA office, you want to send us your prenup. We have a cloud registry that we maintain. And in addition to that, every prenup that we get, we also send to the Beth Din of America, where they have a cloud registry. So it's saved in the cloud in 2 places. And then in addition to that, we email you sort of a digital copy, you have the original copy. So we try to make sure that there are a variety of copies available and have multiple backups. So definitely send us prenups afterwards for that purpose. And the one other piece is that in New York, a rabbi can serve as a notary. In other states, that's not the case. So we can also help you figure out how to work out that notary piece. And one final piece is that there are some difference in different jurisdictions. So Canada has its own prenup. Israel has multiple prenups. California has its own prenup. So just check with us. One thing that we see a lot is that couples are starting out their lives and they don't know where they're going to be. They are thinking about making Aliyah, but they're not sure, or they're about to go to Israel, but then they might come back. So always feel free to reach out to us, because we help a lot of people figure out what document makes the most sense for them to sign. And same, I'll add, if you're signing a financial prenup as well, we can give you language on how to consolidate the 2 documents. Because otherwise, the rule of contract is that the last one wins. So if you sign a halachic prenup and then you go sign a financial prenup, now your halachic prenup is not really valid anymore. So we want to just help people figure out what's the broader scheme of what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish, and how can we make sure that the get is protected in that.
Interesting. I'm actually not sure that people who don't have a legal background are familiar with the concept that the last contract is the one that sticks. I think that people think, oh, I signed the prenup and then something else happened in my life and I signed a subsequent document. It does. I actually, like, as you say, it's an aha thing to me, but I don't know that people realize that once you sign another document that it invalidates the previous one. So I'm really glad you said that. I think that's an important note to highlight, and especially as people are signing the prenup, certainly for those of us who are years after the fact. just a funny anecdote, as you said, that you shouldn't sign it at the chuppah or, the day of the wedding because you never know. I was once, I'm an adjunct law school professor at Georgetown University Law School where I teach Jewish law, and I do a section on marriage and divorce in Jewish law. And I had a copy of the prenup in my hand, and I left that class and I ran to a Sheva Brachot celebration where I made it to the end. And as I was leaving, I didn't think that I brought in my stack of papers with me, but I noticed the prenup, a copy of the prenup sitting off at the side, and I was like, I don't think so. And I went to look at it, and it was their prenup. So I almost walked off with their prenup, and that would have been a disaster for everybody. I'm sorry?
I just said there really is something to be said about that. And we always say also, if you're signing it at like a busy event, a party, if you want to make it a thing, just like give a friend a job. People do better when
yes.
they, say
exactly. Give a friend a job, have somebody else hold it. Exactly. Can we spend a second on I guess, what makes a woman an agunah, right? So actually, before we do that, let me go back to a different question. So let's say you missed the boat, right? You got married in 1985, you got married in 2002, you got married last week, and you didn't sign a prenup. What are the options for after the fact?
Sure. So you can sign a postnup. A postnup is not as legally strong as a prenup. However, it can still be valuable and useful. And what I love about the postnup trend is that I think it is extremely strong on the social front. That engaged couples, even if you're, you feel, secure in your relationship, there can still be that bit of anxiety as to, what if I'm indicating something negative about my relationship. But when you see, we had a couple once that were married 50 years and signed a postnup, and it was just it really shows everyone else that this is really about social change and about trying to help the other people in your community, and it's not about feeling anxious about your relationship. So I think that piece is super helpful, and we can also help couples sign that and figure out how to do that logistically. But the postnup is huge.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so let's say, God forbid, a marriage doesn't work out, there's trouble, there's talks about divorce, and she decides that she wants a divorce and he's withholding it. I know that there's all kinds of statistics, it's maybe a little bit off topic, but still within your work, there's all kinds of statistics over what makes somebody an agunah. Walk me through the process over what actually qualifies a woman to be an agunah.
Sure. And the trickiest piece is that no one agrees on this. So whenever we've talked to academics, to statisticians about sort of counting agunot, and the challenge is that who are we counting? It's actually very hard to figure that out. Sort of the technical, the word itself, agunah, means sort of like a chained woman. It comes from the word ogain in Hebrew, which means anchor. The idea is that she's sort of like weighed down. The most common technical definition of an agunah is someone who is not able to get a get when the Beth Din has ordered a get. So this is a case where we're not sort of just taking her word for it, but there's a third party out there saying, yes, this person needs a get. The challenge is that that standard misses, I think, two groups of people. Group number one are the people who can't get that psak from a Beit Din because the Beit Din process is complicated. Another fun fact of Jewish law that a lot of people don't realize is that in Jewish law, a petitioner, a plaintiff, someone who initiates a case, can call someone to court, and the defendant actually has the right to choose an alternative forum. That's something that Jewish law allows. The defendant can say, yes, I'll come to adjudicate this, but I'm going to go over there. I'm not coming to you. And that back and forth creates situations where you have two people who are unwilling to go to the same Beit Din because they have different motivations, the Batei Din have different standards and practices, and yet, because that is a halachically valid response to say, well, I want to go somewhere else, the process gets stalled and people can't move forward. And so you have a huge category of people that have been separated for an extensive period of time that might be civilly divorced, but that don't have that piece of paper from a Beit Din. And so many people would say they're not agunot, but I think that is more complicated. And then the second group of people that are even harder to count are the people who never even get close to being an agunah, but who give up their rights in a significant way because they're very anxious about the get. And that I think is very powerful. The most common reason that we see people withhold the get is that they're using it as sort of a card that they're playing in the divorce. So the idea is you want the get, well, say the judge wants us to split the house 50-50, we'll split the house, 90-10, and then you get your get, and I have the 90, And so you'll see people set things up in that way, and then many women leaving these marriages are extremely nervous about the get, especially if they're coming from an abusive situation where they have good reason to be. We really believe that the get is a form of domestic abuse, and it's often a continuation of the abuse that happens in the relationship. And so you'll see women say, as long as I have custody and my get, I'm good. I don't need anything else. But the consequences of then them and their children really being in poverty for a very long time afterwards because they gave up on all their financial rights, those consequences are really severe. So I think, again, when we're talking about agunot, there's sort of this ripple effect where it might seem like it's a small amount of people, but the number of people whose lives are tangibly impacted by the fact that this is something that happens in our community is really much more significant than we would be able to count with the technical terms.
I mean, you threw out the number before that you have 75 active cases. I don't think that's a small number. To me, one is too many. 75 feels like a lot, especially when you frame the context of it's not just between a man and a woman. There's usually children, there's extended family. It creates rifts in communities. And 75 is a lot. Again, a little bit off topic. What are ways that communities can get involved if it comes to that?
Sure. So communities will often reach out to us for advice, support. We really encourage that, in that hopefully most communities will only get an occasional case that is sort of like the typical ORA case. Meaning that if you're sort of a smaller community, the odds of dealing with like an extremely highly contentious divorce, that's not something that's happening all the time. But at ORA, that's all of our cases. That's what we deal with. And so we really try to serve as a resource to communities. And especially for community rabbis, we try to send the message that sometimes the most important thing to know is what you don't know and when you might need to get some extra support on an issue. So really bringing that in. And in some ways, the most important community message, which I think people don't understand, is that it's very, very important for a get refusal case to get in early. The longer the case goes on, the longer the divorce is going on and it's getting hostile, the more people get entrenched in their positions and the harder it is to get any movement. So if there's a case where especially if there's a history of domestic abuse, you really want that get right at the beginning. Any delay in the get makes it a lot less likely that it's going to be given smoothly, unconditionally, in a timely way. And very often communities will almost have the opposite reaction. That in the beginning, communities will say, well, it's complicated and I don't want to get involved and who knows what really happened and they only separated 8 months ago or only a year and a half ago and what's the rush? And by the time the case has been going on for 7 years, the community is saying, oh, it's 7 years, this is terrible. But at that point, it's late to get involved and it's very hard to really make a difference. So I think the critical piece is for communities to understand that by sending a message in your community that get refusal is really not okay. And yes, if you're separated, by all means, take a couple weeks if you need to figure out what the story is. But the get should really be given on the earlier side whenever possible. And that especially when there is a beat-in ruling, if communities sort of look away in the beginning, then jumping in much later is going to be a lot less effective.
So I know that you work predominantly with the RCA and with the Beth of America. How much do you do outside in the Orthodox community outside of that? And how much do you work with other denominations, with Reform and conservative Jews?
So we work with really a wide variety of Batei Din. We definitely work with some of the classic modern Orthodox ones, with Beth of America, with Beth of Elizabeth. some of the others, but we have cases that really span the denominational spectrum. So certainly if we're working on Hasidic cases, on liquid cases, we're involved with those Batei Din as well. And people are actually often surprised. About 20% of our cases don't identify as Orthodox. Some of those are Israeli cases. So we work on cases where the wives are in Israel and the husbands are in the US or somewhere else. And we also work on cases where there are Israeli women living in the US. So they're not in Israel, they're not necessarily observant, but they're concerned about their personal status or their children's personal status in Israel. And we've worked with conservative women, with reform women. There's really a range. People sort of are traditional when it comes to marriage and divorce. And one of the toughest aspects of the agunah situation is that there's also this potential of mamzerut, that if you start a new relationship and you have a child in that relationship and that child is considered a mamzer, now that child is sort of limited in terms of which communities they can join and how they function in the world. So even a woman who's not observant, for her to make a decision on behalf of future children that's going to limit their options, that's something that people often don't want to do. And so there's actually a significant amount of non-Orthodox sort of communities that we work with. And another factor is that one thing that's different in 2019 than 200 years ago is that you can leave the Orthodox community anytime you want. It's not necessarily simple, but you do have that option. You can join other communities. So we often find ourselves in situations where we're trying to explain to a non-Jewish or non-Orthodox community why this person's get refusal is a problem. And so there is a lot of sort of community education in a really broad way.
I think that you and I talked about this. The CCAR, which is the Reform Movement's Rabbinic Arm, passed a resolution in 2001 at my prompting, precisely because of the scenario that you just described, that a friend of mine was getting divorced. Her husband was no longer wanting to be observant. And the rabbi said to her, I think he just didn't realize, he said, so what? So, you'll be separated and we don't need to rush the get. He's not, nobody's going to remarry him so quickly. And she said, I don't think you understand. He's not observant. What's to stop a non-Orthodox rabbi from performing the marriage? And even though in the Reform movement, they don't require a get by any means, they stand strongly on ethics and would never want to inadvertently aid and abet a recalcitrant husband. So it was a 5-pronged resolution where the rabbis would inquire to make sure that he's not withholding the get, that he give the get before performing a next marriage. So I know that these issues, even though they're like deep in Halachic, really extend beyond the Orthodox community. I'm curious, how does secular law help agunot? First with the prenup, and what happens if there is no prenup?
Right. So the challenge in general, just sort of stepping back for a minute with using secular law for get refusal situations, is that kind of like you have to imagine you're like walking this tightrope. And if you fall on this side, you have all these constitutional issues, mainly the Establishment Clause issues that church and state are supposed to be separate. And if we're, having the court deal with this complicated religious doctrine, that's not good. There are free exercise arguments that get refusers will make, that my personal belief system is not to give a get, so how can you make me give a get? And then on the other hand, you have all these halachic issues, where the baseline halachic standard, halachic consensus is that if a secular court says, Bob, you have to go give a get, that's not valid. If the secular court is enforcing what the religious court is saying, that's okay. But if the secular court is sort of independently making a determination, that's not okay. So really on both ends, constitutional and halachic, we don't want secular courts to be in a position of sort of deciding whether someone is halachically obligated to give a get or something along those lines. The beauty of the prenup is that it sort of follows that narrative, in that it's basically the court saying, do what the Beis Din told you to do. So the Beis Din said you have to give a get, and if you haven't, you have to sort of pay this amount of money. And the civil court is sort of rubber stamping what the Beis Din determined, but the civil court is not making that determination. When it comes to without a prenup, what are your options? They're limited. There are sort of three main buckets of legal tools. The first are statutory options, so creating laws that address the get. New York has two of these laws. They can sometimes be helpful. They can sometimes be very helpful when they apply, but they have limited applicability, and one of them has sort of limited halachic acceptance. And other states have tried to pass get laws and have not succeeded. It's a little bit of like a complicated piece in terms of the constitutional component and just getting the legislature in action on these topics, et cetera. And then you also, there have been some attempts at tort remedies. So specifically, torts are damages claims, and also specifically the intentional infliction of emotional distress, and whether that might be a legal tool that Agunot can use. Theoretically, it should be an option. Practically, it would probably be very specific cases and pretty limited. And then the final piece and the most promising are really contractual options. The best way to use the court to deal with the get issue is by creating contracts about the get. So whether that's a prenup or even language in a settlement agreement, something along those lines, contracts seem to be the best way for us to really protect against get refusal, but keeping in mind constitutional concerns and also Jewish legal concerns.
And what can you say about jurisdictional reach? If somebody is married in the States and runs off to Canada or runs off to Israel, what is the reach then?
So to Israel, the reach is very broad, in that Israel has very much sort of long-arm jurisdiction when it comes to these issues. And the Rabbanut passed a resolution earlier this year that really gave them jurisdiction to sort of any Jew anywhere who happens to like step one foot in the state of Israel. When it comes to other countries, it depends on the country. If someone goes to the UK, if someone goes to Canada, if someone goes to Spain, it's really a question of what's legal in those areas. We work on a number of those cases at ORA, and it's different because you forget how many just differences there are in communities. We worked on a case in Paris once, and we thought about doing a demonstration, and there were two major problems. The first of which was that there's no First Amendment in France, and we were very spoiled with the right that you have in the United States to stand on a street corner and yell if you want to, and that's not sort of a universal right you have in the world. And secondly, there was so much anti-Semitism in Paris that the community said, we're not standing there with our kippahs on a street corner, like announcing that we're Jewish, no way. And so we really had to come up with different tools. So we try to be responsive to the situation, and we're spending a lot of time now figuring out, particularly for US-Israel couples, what's the best prenup for them, and how do we set people up before marriage, keeping in mind that people are moving and the place where they get divorced could be a totally different jurisdiction. So that's something that's like still being settled, but it's definitely an emerging area. And long-term, we want to make sure that prenups have that as much jurisdiction as we possibly can have, and as much thought, keeping in mind that sometimes you think you're going to make Aliyah and you end up in Teaneck, and life can sort of change as you go. So trying to be responsive to that.
I know nobody who resembles that last description. So you mentioned that there are different kinds of prenups. Without going into a lot of detail online now, because I know that it's legal and it's maybe a little bit tedious. What are the websites that people can find these resources?
So in the US, the Beth of America prenup is the most, I've seen drafts of other prenups. I don't know of another prenup that's really widely used. California has a few different versions because California has a community property standard, which is sort of like an awesome legal standard for the spouse with less money. And as a result, everyone in California signs a prenup. And as a result, they have an enormous body of law around prenups, which is different than anywhere else in the country. So they're sort of their own thing. The Beth of America website, I believe, has versions for Canada and for Israel. We have a lot of versions. Israel is actually a really emerging area on prenups. There's a Heskem Lekavod Hadazi, which is an agreement of mutual respect, that I believe is on the EYIM website, IYIM. There's also Center for Women's Justice has a prenup that has sort of like a retroactive component. Sohar has a prenup, which is on their website. And there's really, I'm watching very curious from here, trying to see how those documents will develop in Israel, and if you're just going to have different communities signing different ones, or if one will sort of end up taking the lead. That'll be interesting to see. But the Israeli prenups in general are almost doing the opposite of what we're doing in the US, and that they're trying to create a process around the revenue that still is ultimately valid within the revenue. So they're sort of dealing with a different set of challenges.
Great. Is there anything else that you want to share with us before we part ways?
I'd say the last piece, I mentioned this briefly, but I'll say it again because I think it's super important, is really understanding get refusal as a form of domestic abuse. That's really what's happening here in these cases. And what we see working with Agunot is that being abused is terrible for anyone in any circumstance. But when you're being abused with Torah and Judaism as the weapon, that is very, very impactful. And that is really, really devastating. And then on the other hand, though, when the community is responsive to that, and when the community at large really has a sense of responsibility to make sure that isn't happening, that's sort of a healing experience. So I always try to send the message that, you know, certainly people who are interested in Orva's work in JOFA, a lot of us are concerned about women's issues, about human rights issues. But this should be a concern to anyone who cares about Judaism, even if they're not so invested in those other pieces, because this is really Judaism being manipulated to hurt people, and it just goes completely against our core values as a community. And that's why it's so important that we all have a sense of responsibility to sort of stick up for real Judaism and real Torah in this respect, that this is not Torah. Let's make sure that everyone knows that, and that we really protect the dignity of every person, which is sort of really our core value.
Amazing. Very wise and powerful words. Keshet, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I look forward to continuing our work together.
Same here. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.